walkway of his mansion and made the decision that, unknowingly, would define the rest of his life. At his feet sat Duke, his late wife Emily's German shepherd, shivering slightly as the cold wind pushed fallen leaves across the driveway. The dog looked up at Richard with expectant, soft amber eyes, the same eyes that had watched over Emily during her battle with cancer. But Richard refused to meet them. He kept his gaze locked on the horizon, jaw tight, grief hiding behind a mask of irritation. "Take him away," Richard told the house manager, waving a hand dismissively. "A shelter, a farm, I don't care where. He's not staying here." The manager hesitated. "Sir, Duke was Mrs. Hale's. I know exactly who he belonged to," Richard snapped, his voice brittle and exhausted. "And that's exactly why I don't want him here." Duke lowered his head, sensing the tension, sensing rejection. The subtle whine in his throat was barely audible, but it hit the manager like a tiny knife. Still, orders were orders. And Richard Hale was a man used to being obeyed, especially now, when grief had hardened into something cold and unrecognizable. He had buried his wife 2 days ago. And now he wanted to bury her memory too. The car rolled slowly down the slick streets toward an animal shelter on the outskirts of town. Duke sat quietly in the backseat, the leash loose around his neck. He didn't fight, didn't bark, he simply watched the world pass by, every mile carrying him further from the woman who loved him. As they neared the shelter gate, something unexpected blocked the path. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket with a faint military emblem on the sleeve. His posture was rigid, rain dripping from his buzz-cut hair. And in an uncanny flash of recognition, Duke's ears perked up. His tail thumped once, twice. He let out a hopeful bark. The manager slowed the car. The man stepped forward. "Is that Duke?" he asked, voice steady but edged with disbelief. The manager rolled down the window. "Do I know you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he opened the back door. Duke rushed forward, pressing his face against the man's chest, tail wagging furiously. The man knelt, burying a hand in Duke's fur. For a moment, the storm, the shelter, the world itself seemed to fade into silence. "My name's Jake Lawson," the man finally said, rising. "Navy SEAL, retired." The manager blinked. "Sir, I'm just dropping the dog off. Orders from Mr. Hale." Jake's jaw tightened. So he really did it. His voice dropped to a low growl. "Emily didn't deserve that, and neither does Duke." Before the manager could reply, Jake clipped his own leash onto Duke's collar. "I'm taking him," Jake said. "If your boss wants to discuss it, he knows where to find me." And just like that, Jake Lawson and Duke walked off into the rain, together. When Richard Hale heard what happened, he was furious. Who does he think he is? Richard slammed his palm on the dining table, where Emily's favorite vase still sat untouched. "Some military hero who thinks he can just steal my dog." "Sir," the manager said cautiously, "he said he knew Mrs. Hale." Richard scoffed. "Everyone says they knew her." But deep inside, where his heart still ached and trembled, something else stirred. A memory, a name, a face. Jake Lawson. Emily had mentioned him once, maybe twice. A military man she treated at the Veterans Outreach Clinic she volunteered at. A man she insisted was a good soul who just needed someone to remind him he wasn't alone. Richard had barely listened at the time. After all, Emily helped everyone. He never imagined someone she helped would one day pull Duke out of his life. But he let it go. Or pretended to. Because facing Duke, facing Emily's memories, was still too painful. 3 weeks passed. 3 long, restless weeks where Duke's empty bed haunted Richard every night. Where the faint bark that used to echo through the mansion became a ghost in the dark hallways. Where Emily's absence pressed against him with suffocating weight. One night, unable to sleep, Richard found himself standing in Emily's old art room. Canvases were still set up. Brushes still dipped in hardened paint. On the center table sat a framed sketch Emily had drawn of Duke as a puppy, a gift she once gave Richard on their anniversary. Richard touched the sketch with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, Em," he whispered. I couldn't bear seeing him. He looks for you, he waits for you, and I can't be you." The truth was ugly, uncomfortable, but real. Richard had not abandoned Duke out of hate. He had abandoned him out of fear. Fear that Duke's presence would rip open the wounds he had spent years trying to hide. Fear that the dog who adored Emily would look at him with disappointment. Fear that he would never measure up to his wife's kindness. And in that moment, Richard finally realized something. He wasn't grieving Emily. He was grieving the man he used to be when she was alive. And he needed, to change. The next morning, Richard drove to the address the manager had given him. It was a modest home on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Kids rode bikes nearby, the smell of morning coffee drifting on the breeze. A far cry from Richard's mansion. He walked up the steps and knocked. The door opened. Jake Lawson stood there, wearing a gray t-shirt, a scar visible on his forearm, likely from a mission he'd never talk about. And sitting right beside him, Duke. The dog froze when he saw Richard. His ears twitched. He tilted his head. Then he walked forward slowly, cautiously, stopping a foot away. Richard knelt. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. Duke stepped closer, then closer, and pressed his head into Richard's chest. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His eyes stung. Jake watched silently. After a moment, Duke pulled back and sat between them, tail sweeping the floor. Finally, Jake crossed his arms. "You came. I shouldn't have sent him away," Richard said quietly. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "You were grieving," Jake replied. "Grief makes fools of all of us." Richard looked up. "Emily. She talked about you." Jake nodded. "She saved my life. More than once." They walked inside. Richard noticed Duke rarely left Jake's side. It was clear the two had bonded deeply. "Why did you take him?" Richard asked. Jake exhaled slowly. "Because Emily loved him. And because Duke started visiting the veterans clinic after Emily passed. He'd sit by the door and wait for her. Every day, rain or shine." Richard swallowed hard. Jake continued. "When I heard you gave him up, I couldn't stand the thought of him being tossed aside like a piece of property. Not after everything Emily did for me." Silence filled the room, until Jake spoke again. So softly it almost didn't seem to fit his powerful frame. "If you want him back, you can take him." Richard blinked. "Just like that?" Jake shrugged. "He's not mine. He never was. Dogs choose their people. And Duke still looks for you." Richard stared at Duke, and then at Jake. "You're a good man," Richard said. "Emily was right about you." Jake shook his head. "I'm just returning kindness she gave me when I didn't deserve it." Another quiet moment passed. Then Richard said something that surprised even himself. "Would you help me learn how to take care of him?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You, a millionaire who probably has 10 people to walk his plants." Despite everything, Richard laughed. Really laughed. For the first time in months. Jake smiled slightly. "Yeah, I'll help." And just like that, an unlikely bond began forming between a grieving millionaire, a battle-scarred Navy SEAL, and a loyal dog who had lost the person he loved most. Over the next weeks, Richard found himself spending more time at Jake's home than his own. They trained Duke together, took him on morning runs, taught him new commands. Duke thrived under the attention, darting between them like a furry bridge connecting two very different worlds. Along the way, Richard learned about Jake's PTSD. His isolation, the nights he didn't sleep, the guilt he carried from missions no one would ever hear about. And Jake learned about Richard's loneliness. His regret, how wealth couldn't fill the empty spaces Emily left behind. In teaching Richard how to care for Duke, Jake was teaching him how to reopen his heart. And the lessons didn't go unnoticed. One evening at sunset, Jake and Richard sat on a grassy hill behind Jake's house. Duke sprawled between them after an exhausting play session. "I want to set up something," Richard said suddenly. "In Emily's name." Jake looked over. "A charity. A fund," Richard corrected. "For veterans therapy dogs. For men like you. For dogs like Duke. She always believed animals heal people. I think she was right." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Richard nodded. "For what?" "For not giving up on Duke. Or yourself." The sky darkened, stars blinking awake. Richard exhaled, feeling something lifting, something heavy that had anchored him for too long. "Jake," he said softly, "I don't want Duke to leave you. He loves you, and you need him just as much as he needs you." Jake looked startled. "Are you sure?" Richard smiled for the first time in a long, genuine way. Absolutely. I'm not giving him up. I'm sharing him. Duke lifted his head, barked once in agreement, and flopped back down with a sigh. It was settled. Duke belonged to both of them. And in a strange, beautiful way, Emily had brought them together. Months passed. The veteran K9 fund grew rapidly. Dogs were trained, veterans found healing, and Richard and Jake became unlikely but unbreakable friends. Duke became a symbol of hope, visiting clinics, comforting soldiers, sitting beside men who hadn't spoken in months until a gentle nudge from Duke unlocked something inside them. One afternoon, as Richard watched Duke resting his head on the lap of a trembling young veteran, he felt Emily's presence so strongly it brought tears to his eyes. "Thank you," Richard whispered toward the ceiling, toward the sky, toward wherever she might be. "Thank you for leaving me this gift." But the most pivotal moment came one evening when Jake and Richard were hosting a small gathering for veterans and their families. As Duke played with a group of excited children, an elderly veteran approached Richard. "You did something powerful here, son," the man said. "But tell me, what made you start all this?" Richard paused. Then he answered quietly, "A dog taught me to feel again. And a Navy SEAL taught me how to be human again." The old veteran nodded slowly. Sometimes the strongest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. Richard looked across the yard at Jake, who was laughing with a group of soldiers. Duke bounded toward him, tail wagging wildly. And for a moment, for a perfect, fleeting moment, Richard felt whole. Not wealthy, not powerful, just human, loved, connected, alive. That night, as Richard stood by his car, Jake approached him. "You okay?" Jake asked. Richard smiled warmly. "Better than okay." Jake nodded, glancing at Duke. "He's changed you." "No," Richard replied. "You both did." Jake blinked, taken aback. "I didn't do anything. You reminded me," Richard said, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, "that kindness isn't weakness. That loss isn't the end. And that a man's true wealth isn't his money, it's the lives he touches." Jake swallowed hard. "Emily believed that." "I know," Richard whispered. "And now I do, too." They stood in silence as Duke trotted over, nudging both men with his nose until they laughed. And in that laughter, in that small, beautiful moment, something profound settled into Richard's heart. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering rightly. About honoring love with action. About choosing compassion over fear. Duke barked again, breaking the stillness. Jake grinned. "He's telling you to stop being sentimental." "Then he's definitely Emily's dog," Richard said, laughing. They walked back toward the house together. Man, soldier, and dog. 3 hearts stitched together by loss, love, and the unexpected power of second chances. And that night, Richard finally understood the lesson the Navy SEAL had taught him. When life breaks your heart, you can either build walls, or build bridges. He chose the latter, and it saved him.